Welcome, everybody. Sorry for the delay. Thanks for joining in. It's going to be a fun one tonight. Some really interesting off air conversation about topics that we can discuss. And yeah, wow, my mind's racing. I'm just thinking of all the things that I can somehow contribute to this subject matter. But yeah, Longo,
Oh,
why don't you introduce Topher?
I'd be happy to. So tonight we're joined by Ben, the archivist, analog, however you choose to know him, myself, and our special guest tonight is Christopher Gardner, the Topher himself, right?
Yes.
And he is a gardener in the
Yes.
truest meaning of the word. So Topher here, you're in Costa Rica currently?
No, I'm actually in my farm in Missouri. I go to
Oh,
Costa
okay.
Rica next week.
Okay. Well, in and out of the, Gulf of Mexico, our breadbasket, just across the pond. But basically, he is a wealth of information in terms of building with earth, permaculture, right? Some of the plant medicine and such
Yes.
around Central America, et cetera, et cetera. And well, with that, I'll let you introduce yourself a tad bit more, Topher. Thanks for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here. You both have been a great wealth of information for me. So this is just a joy. I'm a South Florida boy originally, and I've kind of lived all over the world. I've lived abroad outside the United States for 20 years between India, Costa Rica, and Central Europe. And so uh, my escapades have kind of taken me into construction. I come from a family of architects and builders.
Mm,
So it was just kind of in my blood. So it was just one of those things that I did not go to school for, but my dad was always taking me on site as a child. All the houses we would build, I was always on site, and he would show me things. And because he
mm,
built skyscrapers, I got to go to see really cool tests on materials as a kid. And so I learned like what will hold up and what won't hold up in hurricanes.
mm.
And so that got me fascinated in domes at a very young age. And when I became an adult and had my own money and moved to Costa Rica, we had a lot of earthquakes there. So it just made sense that I would start building domes there because domes are so earthquake resistant. But at the same time, the dome technology, especially the geodesic dome technology, wasn't exactly ideal for what I needed to do. So I graduated into a building with Super Adobe, which is flexible form rammed earth construction. And then from that, I went into geopolymers. The
Mhm.
geopolymers became very, well, I shouldn't say became, geopolymers from a cost perspective are pretty much just for military people,
Would
military
you,
organizations.
not to cut you off, would you define geopolymer? Because that's kind of a, especially on YouTube, it's a bit of a misnomer. So if you wouldn't mind giving me your
Well,
definition.
geopolymer, the way it was explained at the school I went to in Saint Michel, France, the Geopolymer Institute, very simply is man-made stone.
Okay.
And so it's an acidic reaction with your aggregate. So instead of like with concrete, you have an alkaline reaction with some sort of calcium-based binder. We usually use Portland cement in standard construction. with with the geopolymers, there are calcium bits in it. Like they'll use, crushed seashells. They'll use all these types of things as an aggregate. But the actual binder has an acidic reaction. That's why over time it becomes stronger. It becomes denser because our
Mm,
overall air and water is from alkaline to acidic, or from neutral to acidic. It's not from neutral to alkaline. And so geopolymers have a much greater half-life than concrete. Concrete's a great product if it's done right. It's just that most people don't do it right. I love concrete. I make things out of ferro cement all the time. But geopolymers, if you have the specific, I guess you'd say, catalysts for it, they're absolutely remarkable because you're making stone. And so once I found out about geopolymers and saw how casting and forging work with it, it became very apparent to me that a lot of the old, what was called Roman cement, and a lot of these old structures weren't carved. There weren't these massive boulders that they're moving,
Right.
from one place to another. They were literally they were pouring casts and then, just propping things into position. That's why they could have such precision.
Mm-hmm.
Because any builder will tell you the best way to build is to build in the shop, like have a big enough shop where you can pre-build everything, collapse it, move it on site, and then put it up. That's when you can control the environment that you're building on, or you're not building out in the field. That's when you're going to get this high precision. And, you'll never have a top of the end, cabinet maker or door maker ever build on site. They always do it in a controlled environment. So I was just seeing these structures and all this architecture around the world where it was very evident that the consciousness of these structures was so high. It's not just the material that they were using, it was the placement. It was just like I was in a temple in southern India where the goddess that they were representing, she still was in alignment with the stars. Like it was utterly amazing. And so I was like, this just isn't a materials thing, it's a consciousness thing. And I had been
living structures.
Yes, and I had been a real fan of Victor Schauberger, who was a big proponent of the Hermetic principles. And so everything that he was saying was like the quality of the water, the quality of the music, and the quality of the forest determine the consciousness of your civilization. And for me, I was just like, I have to give back to that principle. I have to be somebody that, because it just turns me on. It's not that I have like this do-gooder thing in me. It's just like, I was like that. It was the second I read Schauberger, it completely changed my life. And I knew what my purpose was with this.
Love it, man.
So many overlaps with Schauberger, and, he was really ridiculed now, but more and more as we progress, you see the harmony in everything, right? Even something, when man was creating something, kind of like the whole narrative of God from creating man from clay, it's almost the same thing, even with buildings. And, we're so used to the narrative that they, the Bellback Cyclopean narrative that they carved these stones, right? And levitated them or whatever, floated them down river, transported them hundreds of miles. But I think you're probably agreeing with us in a lot of these respects that the 90% of this quote Cyclopean stuff was made on site.
Definitely.
And probably in a method that you're suggesting, correct?
Yeah, Dr. Davidovitz, the gentleman I studied geopolymers under, he actually was kicked out of Egypt in the late 70s. Harari Hawass, the guy that, has the whole BS around slaves building the pyramids.
Yeah, the British put in charge of it all.
Yeah. He was after my teacher like you wouldn't believe, because he was like, no, look, I can actually replicate. I can do to a 99% accuracy of what these are composed of. And he did it. And this is a man that has billion-dollar, well, he himself doesn't receive $1 billion, but he consults on billion-dollar military projects all over the world. So, follow the money. Like, the people that have the money use the geopolymers, but the people that are spitting the BS historical narrative don't want people to know that there's a better product. Because more than likely, all the things that are like getting ready for cataclysm or whatever, they're probably doing it with geopolymers. And
Yeah.
The reason my teacher, he was specific. He was like, the reason why geopolymers diminished over time was because the catalyst for the geopolymer became more and more rare. And so as that catalyst sort of wasn't cheap and easy to get, then
Will you define catalyst?
the catalyst is what makes the binder bind.
Okay. And there are different kinds.
Correct? Yeah. I don't want to misspeak, because depending on what clay you start with, you have different catalysts.
Right. Yeah.
And so this is,
like you mentioned, alkalinity and acidity, those levels, just like farming, just like planting in the ground.
right. And alchemy, like the alchemist, I was totally turned on by all this, because the alchemists I knew were extracting gold from magnetite. And their whole process was just putting magnetite in a slurry and then changing the pH of the slurry at different stages, and then you would get the ormus, the orbitally rearranged monoatomic elements.
This is exactly how they get radium.
Yeah.
This is like
radium is extracted in the slurry in the exact same method from
we're so deep at 11 minutes. I'm just like a viewer at this moment.
Not to get it too far, and the reason that the catalyst things clicked into me was that I know catalysts and pH levels. My father was a foreman. He worked construction. We live in Portland, Oregon. Mm-hmm. Portland cement is what we're famous for. Yeah, is what we're famous for here. I grew up going to an island in the middle of the Columbia River that is notorious for having the best aggregate in the world for cement. At least the standard kind of standardized cement, right? Obviously, there are very custom one-offs that depend on climate. And as you mentioned, people that are looking for high-end, everlasting types of structures, they have a very specialized style, and they know that they got to pick from the right area and for the right climate and all these other things. But anyways, and there's huge ships and huge industry on the river all around us, developing aggregates, separating the aggregates, sand, stone, pebbles, right, for all these different layers. And my father would tell me all the time, like he talked about binders.
Exactly.
Right. And so what's the relationship between a binder and the catalyst?
Okay, so a normal catalyst. So I'm not a chemist, by the way. So all the chemists out there, give me a little leeway. So the way I understand it is, so Portland cement in and of itself is a binder. And what that does is it acts like glue between aggregate.
Right.
So people, depending on what you're making, you're going to want the aggregate to perform a certain function. Like if you're putting like a stucco on a wall, you want it to move smoothly and then not crack. If you're doing floor work, you want compressive strength. So the aggregate's going to be a little bit rougher. It all depends like what you're trying to do, right?
Right.
The cool thing with a geopolymer is whatever the catalyst is that makes the geopolymer go. Sometimes it's fly ash, sometimes it's this product called natron, and it's naturally occurring natron. It's not the chemically derived natron. What that does is, instead of the aggregate, all these little pieces of aggregate, being right next to each other, what it does is it actually fuses them. There isn't binder between the aggregate.
Got it.
The aggregate becomes the actual thing. That's why it's considered a man-made stone.
Right.
And so there's this magic, like Dr. Davidovitz, he was able to recreate in Egypt. He showed that the calcium that was from whatever the shellfish were in the Nile River, that was like, a third or a quarter of their base. They had silica obviously there because of sand. They had massive deposits of calcium bentonite clay. So calcium, even if it's not acting like as a permanent binder, it's still gluey. it's still really good to mix with things. Like when you mix it, it just kind of sticks to everything. That's why our bones are made out of it. And then they were burning the forest because the entire North Africa was a forest. And so for every pyramid they built, the forest got further and further away because they had to get fly ash, which is ash that is produced over 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's this super, super white ash that has no salt in it. And then they would add this other product called natron. And in that mixture, when they would tumble that in place, they would tumble it in place. They already would have the casing stone from the previous one built. And then they were able just to, with forms on 3 sides, pour it in there. And then they they know that the casing stones were dark. And that was always a big question. And the reason why was they needed thermal gain, because when you heat a geopolymer, it sets 4 times as fast and twice as strong. So when you look at a cross section of the Great Pyramid of Giza, when I see it as a rocket mass heater. Probably because I build rocket mass heaters, but I know if they use geopolymers, they wanted the thermal gain from the outside and then they heated it from the inside.
That sounds like terracotta, obviously slightly different, but
Yeah.
it's a similar, because terracotta, like when you actually look into it, as we talked a little bit off air about this, but we can say it now that you're in agreement kind of with us and, obviously countless of people out there that think that we kind of went from a far more advanced technology and it seemed far simpler, right? And it's got more complex and less advanced.
Mm-hmm.
And terracotta, when they first started like really analyzing it and reproducing it, it was incredibly difficult. And this is kind of like geopolymer. We had to relearn these things that seem simple, but it's so like to make the really, really long lasting stuff. It's a science down to the half a percentage, when we're talking about binders and catalysts and all these things, right? And environment. And then on top of that, how the material sets, the environment in which it sets has to be controlled too. It doesn't have to be, but to make the best finished product, you want it to be.
Well, even today, like if I'm doing ferro cement, I'll wait for a rainy day. Okay. Because the worst thing that you ever want is that thin shell of concrete that you're making to dry out too quickly.
Okay, so the humidity and stuff helps.
The humidity helps. That's why I got into ferro cement in the tropics. Is like with 99% humidity, it's ideal. Like I'm just going to throw a piece of plastic on it and it'll stay wet for 4 months.
And Adobe is like the opposite end of that spectrum.
Exactly.
Right? Okay.
Like that's why I went into super Adobe, because originally I was doing these presses and trying to make regular Adobe. Does not perform well in the tropics.
Got it.
And then my mentor, who was from Iran, he created the super Adobe process at Cal Earth University. And essentially you use these long sacks and you backfill them with earth and then you it's rammed earth construction. So you're not at the whim of what the environment is doing. It doesn't matter if it's hot. It doesn't matter if it's cold or wet. As long as you can control the internal moisture of your material that's going inside your forms, you're good.
Got it. Now, one of my favorite subjects is that the world was a very similar climate all around the world. And, you mentioned Mexico off air, and you have experience in Central America. Now, if they were building pyramids in Alaska, let's say, and similar, if not identical, to Egypt and Mexico,
right?
Would you say that climate? I mean, we obviously just said that here, but do you see similarities between geopolymers around the world, or do you see that they're different in all these different places and they're utilizing the materials they have, or do you think that we're dealing with a culture that was sharing similar ideas?
I've only seen the case study of the comparison from the Giza Plateau to the Peruvian pyramids.
Okay.
And those were, what's that?
And what'd that say?
They were essentially the same material.
Okay. See, I think they are similar everywhere, and that obviously there are slight differences, but we're dealing with, similar to like Longo brings to the table with languages, and that things kind of go back to one similar root. I think construction, that's
Right.
probably the same scenario. And
Yes.
geopolymers would be a big nod to this.
Yes, definitely. And the whole thing that I like what you guys are bringing to the table, and it's something I've felt forever, especially because when you build, you get kind of practical about things. So you don't oversize things if you don't need to.
Yeah,
Like
it's all simple.
you're not gonna make a door that's like 17 feet tall, or
Mhm.
you're not gonna put bookcases 20 feet tall. Like you're
Right,
just not gonna do that. It doesn't matter how rich the person is,
right.
how ostentatious they want to live. I guarantee you that the court builder wasn't going, hey, let's just build these massive doors and windows just for the fuck of it.
Right.
No way.
Yeah.
We were dealing with much bigger people
Hmm.
that had a very, very excellent mind. They lived longer so they could perfect their craft. Like I've been at my craft for 25 years, and I just now feeling like I'm starting to know a little bit. Could
Yeah.
you imagine somebody that lived 300 years? Like you had 250 years to put into your craft.
Yeah. It
Like,
makes
could
me
you?
think about Baroque music and, not only
Ugh,
architecture, but the arts
yeah.
300 years and longer ago were incredible. And we were so far removed from those things.
And I have to say, one of the joys of my life is, for whatever reason, I've been blessed with time to think. I got myself out of Western culture, which was rush, 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 and I lived abroad in areas where I could literally just fuck around and experiment for a while. And experimenting and thinking, most people don't have time to think.
Hmm.
And
Mhm.
could you imagine having a lifespan that's 3 times our current lifespan? You could really sit there and contemplate and observe nature. You could observe things, and you could really watch and see and understand, oh, this is the way I should do it. There
Yeah.
wouldn't be the rush that most people feel right now.
It's like when you get out of the city, you
Right.
know. I had a farm for almost 10 years, and I lived in the country, and I lived in the city, and I'm in the suburbs now. I live on a golf course now. I lived on a farm. I lived in downtown, and I've experienced all of those things. And it's amazing how much your environment affects everything about you, the way you think, everything.
Hmm.
So yeah, and I can only imagine you magnify that, like you said, the things you listen to, the things you read, the building you live in,
Yes.
all these things add up over time.
Yeah,
And
and they really knew, at least the people. I should, when I say they, what I'm referring to is those structures and those things that we have standing today, that the historical narrative doesn't explain well enough.
right, yeah, it's vague for a reason.
The consciousness that went into the majority of these buildings were from higher order beings. These were beings that understood the sky clock. They understood geomagnetics, ley lines. They understood water. They obviously understood vibration. Like they just had a much greater understanding of the natural world and the metaphysical world.
I agree. Yeah, we know Longo agrees. Longo, you're quiet, so I don't want to talk too much and write you out of the conversation with the guest you brought on. So what's going on over there? Oh, you're on mute. You're mute.
Muted.
So number one, I love that you guys are hitting it off, and I'm just tuned in. I'm learning right now. I'm learning a bunch. But could we pull up this window down here, Ben? If you
Oh
see
yeah,
that,
yeah. Yep.
please. So it's funny, you know, St. Augustine, which when I've been on Topher's show,
Mm-hmm.
the Biocharisma podcast, the links down there. When I was on his show, and of course in many of my videos, I've talked about St. Augustine a lot. And this isn't just a Florida thing because, hey, We all are American for the most part, most of us. And St. Augustine, America's oldest city, ancient city. No coincidence. These structures in America's most ancient city, quote unquote, what do they build the entire city out of? Okay. Cast coquina limestone. And why am I especially bringing it up again? Because what are all of these little features and embellishments and little decorations, the inlays, the carvings? Those are all terracotta. Those are all red terracotta with, I assume, a high iron content, because they're still there. They're, like armor. They're still there. They don't need to get replaced that often. They don't chip off. Those buildings look brand spanking new. They're from 1888 in downtown St. Augustine.
That whole thing is a battery. When you have that much mass, like in building super Adobe, you build with a lot of mass.
Can I stop you? Can I say one thing? Is there usually liquid in the middle of batteries?
It doesn't. It can be a dry state battery.
Dry state, exactly.
Well, I was just saying because this one happens to have. Here, let's take a look on the inside of this one.
Most batteries do. They'll have a electrolyte that is liquid based, but there are dry state batteries. I think that's what the red brick is.
That's the inside of this one right here.
You said that they flooded that though, right?
No, this is allegedly.
They drained it. They drained it. It was the reverse. It was designed to be like this, and they drained it.
Yep. Allegedly, this is the original swimming pool / lobby. So.
That's so great.
Yeah, and Longo's mentioned this before, and just in case for people listening and haven't heard it before, but me and Longo have talked endlessly about the idea of the hotel. Hotels were all built on healing springs of some kind, and the travel industry, the leisure industry, vacation. It wasn't like we think of it today. It was, you left your area because you may have had an ailment of some kind,
right?
Or it became fashionable to visit these places, and that's kind of lost today. And a lot of these really old world hotels, from California all the way to Florida, every single one of them had a sauna and a pool.
Yep, that's the bath, right? Sorry, that's the Turkish steam right here.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Awesome.
Yeah.
That's 140 years old, just about, almost.
Yeah, because that's the way it was in Europe, in like Austria and southern Germany, the termars. You go from this cold, mineral-rich pool to the hot sauna, and you go back and forth, and after a few hours, like you're a new being.
Can we talk about the word sauna and
yes,
how it's of Finnish origin?
Yeah, and what was that? Sorry, Topher. What was that word you just used? Tar?
I pronounce it, and I could be saying it wrong. Termar.
I mean, just look at those two roots there. And what does that mean? That means
it was like in southern Austria. That was like their sauna / cold pool system, where you go from a cold mineral pool, to a hot sauna. You go back and forth, and it's like, some people, I've never been into a Turkish or Russian sauna per se, but the termars in Central Europe are like, it's essentially like you go from hot to cold.
Yep. There was a nice plunge in that hotel as well.
Yeah. One of my episodes, I have a show called Anomalous America, and one of them was about a cave in Colorado. And they said that they found the oldest example of the Turkish bath in history, they think. And it was built down underground in a cave. And the cave was a radium cave, and it had tons of hot. The water was super hot. You couldn't swim in the water, but they built a room where the steam was coming up into the room.
Wow.
And, Longo and I have talked about this forever now, that a lot of these steam sauna baths, they were using the radium emanations, because obviously radium's too dangerous in its pure form.
Mhm.
So mixing it with water was really, really important. And then gas, of course, inhaling it was part of
Now,
that too.
can I jump in here? This top right picture is a picture of the Suwannee River in Florida. Arguably the most famous river in America in terms of folklore and music and literature outside of America. The Mississippi, of course, is the greatest river, but the Suwannee has been immortalized in song. And that song is often known more by non-Americans than Americans down on the Suwannee River. But the Suwannee is a native word, Suwannee. But anyone who knows my research and all the Finnish links, sauna Suwannee, sauna Suwannee. Now, the Suwannee is the river. There's two rivers in Florida that have the most hydrotherapy architecture or hydrotherapy. What would be the word? Infrastructure. The spas, the baths, the plunges, hot, cold on the Suwannee River alone, there were dozens and dozens. And these were all only accessed, for the most part, via steamboat. A steamboat on probably the Plant line, Henry Plant line.
Mm-hmm.
And now let's touch on the radium. Look at the color coming off of that water.
That's incredible.
Right there. Now, sulfur is responsible and largely for that color, but not just the orange, the swampy colors that glow in Florida, but the bright blue. Radium is largely responsible for this.
Mm-hmm.
Just now, I had a great comment. Someone told me about Gatorade, how the original Gatorade had radium. Was that me and you talking about that?
Me and you talked about. We said that on maybe it was the last of the previous last live.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, and if you watch Waterboy, there's weird nods. There's weird radium nods in that movie.
What was he in? Louisiana, right?
Yeah.
Or Gulf of Mexico.
And then he's, they talk about, Gatorade and the battle between Gatorade and radium, water and Gatorade.
Now, let's talk about this. Certain animals have been used for thousands of years to distill certain trace minerals, elements, right? Mm-hmm. Because their own organism, just, by nature, accumulates certain trace elements. And humans have picked up on that. And therefore, there's people who know what organ of the cow, what gland to get a certain nutrient that you can't find anywhere else. Well, the same goes for reptiles. And when we're talking about a weird land such as Florida, with rivers that are teeming with radium, and I'm about to show you, for anyone who thinks, radioactivity, these are some stretches. No, you can see in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, they were proving without a shadow of a doubt, the Suwannee River is measurably radioactive. So
and we've talked about horseshoe crabs.
Yep.
Their blood is the most radioactive of many of the crustaceans. And
where the Suwannee comes out to the ocean is where you'll find some of the most horseshoe crabs on the Gulf Coast of Florida.
Yeah, I believe it. I mean, that's the whole blood thing. And we talked about radium and crystals and how radium impregnates its light on crystals and different wavelengths. And the crystals absorb different colors. Mm-hmm. And that quartz and diamond turn bright orange, like an orange.
You guys see this? Yeah, radium in the Suwannee River and estuary. Spring and river input into the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, and the first time we mentioned this, we talked about that study from the 70s where not only do we talk about the Gulf of Mexico water temperatures, but also that it's the most radioactive water in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No coincidence.
Right. Well, we're at radium again.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Well, Topher, in your mind, when we talk about like chemicals, special chemicals, right? Are there certain things that you always keep an eye out for when you're dealing with building materials that can cause negative effects or things that you've noticed in your time dealing with these substances? Because you're dealing with large amounts of earth. You're bound to be getting the odd, chemical,
Oh,
crystal, whatever.
well, aggregate, like it all depends what you're doing. So because I spent the majority of my time, my building career in the tropics where I was, they were very aggressive bugs. And so there was all this folklore in the area where I was building from the old time Costa Ricans. They're called ticos, where they talked about felling trees at only one time a year, or if you're going to cut bamboo, cut it at one time a year. And so that's where my expertise was, because I was a natural builder. Like, depending on if I was going to use coconut fiber in my cob mixture, or if I was going to make like an earthen floor, or like, let's say I was going to do a bamboo structure, it absolutely had to be cut in the last quarter phase of the moon. And usually you
Wow.
only had the last quarter phase of the moon, and you had that in the dry season. So no water was up in the actual cane itself. You
Love
wanted
that.
the water to be down in the rhizome. Depending on which hardwood you were going to use, you had to let it cure for a certain period of time. And then I got into biochar, not just for the carbon amendments for agriculture, for permaculture, but I originally got into it as a curing method for wood. So because it's so moist there all the time, you had to find a way to kind of carterize cellulitic material. So we would take bamboo, or we would take, full, let's just call them rounds of trees, and we'd essentially scorch the bottom of them to where they were completely charred, so that if you put that anywhere near where water would be, the tube of the cellulitic material wouldn't suck water into it.
Got it.
We found that all the petrochemicals that people use, all of them without fail, would fail if the natural aspect of the natural products that you were using wasn't paid attention to. So what I mean by that is, like, say somebody just went ahead and felled a bamboo plantation to build a house at the wrong time. It didn't matter how much copper sulfate they used. It didn't matter how much borax they used. It didn't matter all the chemical inputs that they would put into the plant, into the cellulitic material, made no difference. The structure would fail. It would be a waste of money. But if you win it,
Can I
go ahead.
just sorry to interrupt? Ultimately, you touched on the moisture aspect to this, but what
Yes.
we're really talking about is, because at the end of the day, if you can't make basic minerals interact the way they should, we're speaking about a magnetic influence, an unseen influence that's overtaking what should be basic 1 + 1 = 2, right?
Mm-hmm. And you'll get a kick out of this too, because the natural methods were so much better than like the store bought big box stuff. So one thing that we would do is, when we were harvesting bamboo, you would cut the bamboo. Like I said, you'd cut it at low tide during the lowest tide of the year. And then you wouldn't take the cane out of the stand. You'd actually just put the cane directly on top of what we called a live rock. And so the live rock was like, you could have two rocks that were the same shape, came from the same river, but the live rock kind of glittered at you, you know? It had this life to it. You could tell, and it also felt, when you were holding it, it felt heavier. Even though if you were to weigh it, it was the same. So it's like the same thing in massage. Like, some people could weigh the same, but one person, the energetic density of them is so much higher. So if you put the cane on top of one of these live rocks, that would make it cure so much better. And it was the same, like depending, like I got into smoke curing because that's what the Japanese people did the most. And it was this wonderful system. Like when I was making my biochar, I just created a flume where I put all my wood. And what that did was it changed the chemical composition of the carbon. Whenever smoke goes over stuff, it does something to the carbon that it touches. And then it also distributes oil from whatever you were burning. And here's the coolest thing, because whenever you're dealing with construction, you have to think of like, okay, what is in my environment that's going to attack this structure? The main thing that oxidizes everything in the world is the universal solvent, is water. So normally you're first protecting your building from water, but also insects. There's a reason why I think these advanced cultures, these advanced older societies built with masonry is because guess what? The insects don't mess with it.
Yeah.
Especially if it's done correctly.
Isn't that why cedar was so prevalent in certain areas?
Oh, I bet.
Because cedar's naturally pest resistant, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also they had ways of water curing. Could you imagine these rivers that were unmolested, that had these cold water currents? Schauberger talked about it all the time, where you could cold water cure a piece of wood. Like, you ever hear the story of Stradivarius?
Mm-mm.
No.
So the Stradivarius violins, right?
Yeah.
You've heard of those?
Of course.
I haven't.
Okay, the Stradivarius violin is like the penultimate violin in the world. I think there was only 100 of them made.
Best acoustic properties. Yeah.
Best acoustic properties. And what had occurred was the gentleman that made them, he found inside a river at the base of the Alps. I forget how he actually came across it, but he found a bunch of trees that had been cold water curing in the middle of the river. And he was able to get them out. And when he hit the wood, he could tell immediately that, oh my God, this is like a totally different thing. To the point where he hid from his whole community what he was doing, because he didn't want anybody else to go into the river at that specific point and get that wood. And he made the world's best violins out of this cold water cured, I forget what type of wood it was, but it was a high alpine wood. And to this day, like, they don't degrade or anything. And Schauberger was all about, like, in the old world, that's the way carpenters would work. A carpenter just wouldn't go down to Lowe's or Home Depot and buy some crap pine that was farm raised. The carpenter knew the forester. They knew who was actually cold curing, who was smoke curing. And they had all these different ways of letting nature cure it the way nature does, to actually give you a superior product.
Yeah. Since we've been mentioning Austria, my father's side of the family is from Austria and Poland. Mm-hmm. And we had a piano store
wow. Are you kidding me?
No, pre-World War II. And we were piano salesmen and repairmen. And his whole family, they all played the piano. And they talked about this all the time, that within 100 years, all the good wood would be gone.
Exactly.
And these instruments would never exist again. And they've invested in buying pianos from, the 1800s and the 1700s even. And look at them now. I mean, pianos and violins, and I mean, everything's skyrocketed, obviously, but musical instruments have been one of the secret ways of, you don't put money in the bank, a real investor will tell you, old instruments.
Old speakers.
Really?
Old amplifiers.
Yeah, I've heard that about the older electronics were far better.
Yeah.
Yes. The solders. Listen, the soldering alone. One of the things about that, I am like an amateur luthier. I can do some of the inside work on my electric guitar. And one of the things that sets almost all the guitars apart from the 60s and prior, is that the soldering was like jewelry quality,
Mhm.
you know, in all these instruments. Whereas now it's like you're lucky if you get a solder that you can even, you know, find on the
On the
table of
breadboard.
elements,
Mhm.
because it's like some Bangladeshi trash, you know, it's mostly whatever.
Yeah.
And that alone shaped the sound of the 60s.
Mhm.
You know, this solder in just the behind the curtain components of all these instruments, amplifiers, etc. So yes, and that's essentially the aggregate, or, you know, if I don't know if I'm using those terms out of place, but that's fusing, allowing a signal to pass from
Exactly.
one cable to a pot, a pickup, whatever it is in the guitar, that is allowing the current to pass through
Mhm.
it. So
And that brings up a great point, because your failure in almost everything that you make or engineer is where you have to fasten something.
mhm.
So the solder is a fastening point, you know, in like these old buildings. Another reason why they did masonry buildings is because there's no failure in the fastening points.
Yeah.
You know, the best wood construction in the world is mortise and tenon construction, where they don't use any extrinsic material to pin two things. So what I mean by that is, like, if you have cedar beams, you cut them like Lego so that they slide into each other and lock. You don't use a metal pin.
Yeah.
And
This reminds me of Japanese construction. And since you mentioned, I don't know, was it off air? I can't remember, but we talked a little bit about feng shui, right? I think it was off air.
It
And
was.
I always talk about pagodas, and I've talked about pagodas with Longo several times, and the symbolic nature of the pagoda in feng shui, they went hand in hand, and that the pagoda was like a man-made representation of the tree. And they dismantled a pagoda in the 80s in Japan that was like 250, 300 years
oh,
old, and there wasn't a single nail in it.
no.
They were blown away. It was like Lego pieces. Like all the joints were perfect, like laser cut,
Yes.
and there was no nails in anything.
Mhm.
Everything was just like it was it was insane, you know? Like the people taking this apart had no idea. You know, they're in there, they got their hammers, you know, and they're like ready just to start, because they were supposed to be gentle and, you know, this is priceless. And they got in there and they were like, once they started dismantling it, it was like not necessarily 3D printed, but the pieces were like they were 3D
Yeah.
printed. And they were just like sliding them apart. You know, it was like a big Jenga.
Mhm.
And that always stuck with me. And it just makes me think of what you're saying. They found boats, petrified boats, buried below ground. They found one in New York. They found several in New York. One of them had no nails in it.
Yeah, the in fact, most of the wooden boats that would fail was because they would use a dissimilar
Material.
fastener,
Yeah, I
you
love it.
know, this dissimilar material as a fastener. And they find that also with all these really high-end acoustic musical instruments.
Yeah.
If you put a metal or a conductor anywhere where you have a cellulitic material, when I say cellulitic material, I mean wood. But the different woods have different tones. They have different warmth.
Just like stone. Yeah.
Yeah, and they
Mhm.
find, like, if you put a piece, like if you're trying to nail it together, each one of those nails is like a splinter in the energetic body of the actual instrument.
I love it. It makes me think of shoes, you
Yes.
know, and since we're talking about buildings and their connection with the earth is just as important as their connection with the sky, right?
Hmm.
That's like shoes today and grounding, right? That's kind of a catchphrase that's catching on lately. And, you know, I remember hearing about the Druids. They would wear these like sandals, Grecian style sandals. But if they had to wear a shoe, like if they were walking in rocky or territory that was unknown, then they had to wear their sandals because they preferred being barefoot. They would always hold a staff, and the staff is what would ground them if they had to wear a shoe that interrupted their
Mm.
connection with the earth. And anyways, tangent, but
No,
since
that's a
you're
really cool thing. I never thought of that, because your hands do have chakras.
yeah,
So that would make
Oh,
total.
that's a definite grounding technique. It's
Mhm.
to hold a wood. That's why all people who are not, you know, impaired physically that use sticks do so. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like the wizards or whatever you would call them. It's obviously druid related. They only needed their staff when they had to
Now,
put on their boots.
according to the Bach saga, do you know what it was? One of the only things that truly separates us from the animal kingdom was our utilization of the walking staff, because you can chalk all of human achievement up to one thing, this or that, but it all uh, falls into our nature, right? It all falls into what humans are supposed to do, and each animal has their own nature. But the thing that truly separates us from animals is the fact that we can prolong our natural life through the use of a walking stick, and that it's not just a technology, right? It's not just a technology, but it actually gives you 15 years or so in the wild. And I know, if in a perfect world everyone's eating holistically, maybe you can run around at 90. But according to the Bach saga, they said all of the animal kingdom, when it cannot walk, when it cannot stand up straight, it dies on the spot. Whereas mankind, through the staff, and this is why the staff is ruled by Capricorn, and Capricorn rules mountains as well. The cap of the mountain
Makes
caps.
me think of Saint Nick too. Of course.
It's the goat, the mountain climber as well. So the staff, you see people marching up mountains with their walking sticks. But and Capricorn rules old age as well. The transition to old age and maturity. You have the staff, which actually increases life, because, as I said, most animals die when they can't walk. Whereas as soon as a man or a woman takes up a staff, they lengthen their life. So the staff is symbolic of many, many things.
It's very Saturnian.
Yeah,
that's really awesome.
And they say, according to the Bach saga, that was one of God's greatest gifts to mankind is the use of the staff. So that's why
great little tangent. It always makes me think of Ogum too. The tree language. That every tree speaks a different language.
Yes.
And through their structure, they communicate something different in whatever ecosystem that they're growing in. I'm sure you can attest to this, especially in a tropical area. One of my favorite subjects is that, long ago when the trees were far larger, man lived in and around the trees, and as someone who spent a lot of time in the, rainforest type of environment, you can attest to this. You get into really dense jungle and you're like in a whole new world. Like you can go a whole day and never see the sun, And I know there are people that live in certain parts of the world where the forest is so dense that you don't see the sun at all unless you make it to a clearing or go somewhere that there's a wide opening.
Well, what do they say about America? That when the Europeans first arrived, you could walk from East Coast America to West Coast America under constant tree cover.
Yeah.
You would have to be way south or way north, because I'm actually learning now that I moved to the Ozarks and actually learning about what the prairie and the savanna actually was. There's a whole ecosystem of grasses that was indigenous to the Americas. That was actually the grasses here, not the forests on the coast. But at least, I'm not talking about way back when there were, home tree and these massive trees. I'm totally in alignment with you both on that. I mean, to the point where the first time I saw Avatar in a theater, my friends thought I was crazy because I was crying. I was so heartbroken when I saw Home Tree go down. It wrecked me, because in my genes, I could feel the truth of that. I was a mess.
Me too.
Classic.
I may not have shed a tear, but I go back to that movie more than any other movie, for sure.
Yeah, I was a mess. Like I was a wreck. But in this particular area, when you start to learn about the ruminant animals and what healthy grass environments are, um, my mind is being blown because I'm such a rookie at this because I have been so focused on what's above the soil and then the soil that I create for gardens. But like what made the savannas and the prairies so magnificent here was that the root structures of the grasses were like, if you had a grass that grew 4 or 5 feet tall, the root structure was shooting down 50
Yeah.
feet into the ground.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. I've seen so many comparisons to, modern crop utilization of today versus 100 years ago.
Yes.
And um, I've shared a lot of some of the um, seeds that they find with these mummies. I don't know if you've
Mm,
seen any of my material on that, but they found cannabis, they've found wheat, they've
hmm
found grasses, they've found corn,
hmm
and they plant it, and it's all insane. Like
hmm
20-foot tall corn, wheat,
Yes.
it's like 10 times the yield.
hmm
Cannabis that, again, cannabis today
Oh
is not
yeah.
what cannabis was 100 years ago. But when they planted it, and we're talking more of the male version, because that was what it was utilized the most of. Of course, the the cannabis was smoked for thousands of years. However, like bamboo, you can grow cannabis, I think 3 crops in a year, and you can make amazing structures out of the plant
Mhm.
material itself,
hmm
yarn and whatever. But anyways, there's definitely a connection there, and the soil I know plays a really big part. And
Plus the vessels that they were storing these things in. Like I'm a nerd in making like egg-shaped water tanks and things like that.
oh yeah,
And these people were masters in diamagnetics and paramagnetics. They
yeah,
knew if you stored seeds in a vessel that resembled an egg, and that egg was made out of, let's say, like a very iron rich bauxite, that would instill the energy of Mars. Like it all, like their knowledge of the phenomenology, like what we call alchemy, was just, I bet you, was just common knowledge. Like if they wanted like the whole pyramid technology, my uncle back in the 70s made a little pyramid thing where you put your razor in it and you never ever have to buy a new razor. You never
like the
sharpen
edge.
it.
Yeah, it stays sharp. Yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because like the edge, it's an ionization thing, and the pyramid negatively ionizes everything that's in it.
I love it.
So like I these what needs to be impressed upon everyone is the fact that it seemed low tech to us initially because we didn't see wires and shit poking out of
Mhm.
everything, and we
Of
were lied
course.
to about all of it.
Well,
But it but it
sorry.
was so far advanced that they didn't need any of that stuff. They were dealing with resonant technology. They were using the building with these shapes, using the waterways, like all the stuff, Longo, that you've presented down in like the Miami area with the Miami Circle. They had these things tuned like instruments where it was emitting a scalar field. Everything was a longitudinal wave,
Mhm.
Yeah,
and
telluric.
whatever would resonate with it would receive it, and then okay, woohoo, we're here. And so these seeds, imagine curing these seeds from back then for however long they've been in those vessels. They're picking up, that's concentrating all that energy.
Yeah,
And,
and they were
hey,
they were stored in weird shaped jars.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that they did say that the jars were either some kind of terracotta or stone. So
I've
yeah,
read all about it. They would send a very high iron rich terracotta, which is a type of bauxite, iron rich bauxite.
that's
yeah,
what St. Augustine is largely made of, that
Yeah.
iron-rich terracotta. And talking about the bricks in old St. Augustine
Mhm.
and downtown Charleston, South Carolina, some of these old world Southeast United States cities, the brick is more metallic than it is clay, than the newer brick.
Wow.
The newer brick that we use today
Uh-huh.
chips and cracks and crumbles, right? It's powdery. It's like, like
Mm-hmm.
what you'd expect, dried clay largely. Okay, man, we were in Tampa and we were at the Tampa Bay University. The driveway is all this old brick, okay? The wheels of the car polish the brick, smooth it
Nice.
down and polish it. They don't chip, they don't crack. You know what I mean? Like today's bricks, they just get smoother and smoother, like cobblestone. But it's metallic. You take something and hit it, it goes clink, 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 like an anvil or something. It's crazy.
So that, in our podcast, we talked about a little bit where I hypothesized that there was probably a volcano, because down in Costa Rica, you could get bauxite that was very iron rich. And so you could do earthen structures out of that type of iron rich bauxite very, very well, because of like what you're talking about. It had magnetite in it, it had iron oxide. And that comes from volcanoes. And so I know when, like in the Temescals that I built, my mentor with Temescal building only built them out of red brick, because he was like, it just makes, like in Mexico, like you only go into a red brick Temescal, because when the heat activates the red brick, and then the red brick emits far infrared, and then now you're in like a far infrared sauna, essentially.
I love
And
it. Yeah, I mean, as a I was in a horrible motorcycle accident and basically was nearly paralyzed, and I still use red light therapy. That's you just like hit home with me there. And that was about 15 years ago. I started 12 years ago with the red light, and going back in the past and seeing red light was being used in a similar way, and they were making glass. Glass is ancient, and they were making red glass out of all these different materials. And they realized, 1,000 years ago, that you could use different minerals to make different colored glass, and they would emit a different frequency of light as it passed through the medium. But anyways, not to go off topic there, but yeah, it just shows you that not only was the layout thought out, the material thought out, but it was a as above, so below, as within, so without relationship, 100%.
And also, it makes sense that they lived longer lives because they built structures to last. If you're only planning on living 80 years, like imagine you live 400 years. You're like, oh, I can't build this thing to only last 25 years. My reputation will be shot. They would build something to last a few hundred years because their reputation was on the line. Like, let's be real. Like we're still in this plane of existence where it's just like, okay, if you do shoddy work, you're not going to work that long, right? So they built things to last because the expectation of presentation was going to be so much longer.
Yeah, you can see that this wasn't like an egotistical thing. No. It wasn't like we want to look cool because when this other country comes to visit, we want to show off our wealth. It was obviously that makes no sense. You just like, here's a perfect example for me. The Philadelphia government building in downtown Philadelphia. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of it. I'll get a picture of it after I finish my thought here. But like many buildings in America, they wanted to tear it down. These quote old world buildings. But the walls are almost 20 feet thick. It has 700 rooms, and it goes 4 stories below ground. And what you just said there's no building in America, at least, that reminds me of this more than this building. And they got like all these architects. They flew them in from Paris, all over, and they went and toured the building for a week. And they're like, this will bankrupt the entire country of America to take this building down. You know what I mean? It's still up today. I'll get a picture here in a second. But I think what you said there is, I couldn't agree with you more. And just the sheer scale and beauty of them, to think that it's some wealthy person or a country representing its people or whatever would build this as some kind of like pissing contest is ridiculous.
No.
And I think this building was built completely, like you said, as a something that would last literally forever.
Mm-hmm.
Are you referring to City Hall or Independence Hall?
I can't remember. That's why I was confused, because there's two different ones. It's the one with the giant clock tower, and it's this, Gothic style. In the middle of the city. It's humongous. You can't miss it in Philadelphia. I'll get a picture of it.
Wow.
But yeah, and again, as someone that's been to India, which I haven't, but I've studied so much of the architecture there. What a wealth. There are places in India where you can just, everywhere you're looking, you're like, this is a country where there's no running water or toilets or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And people have nothing. But
Mm-hmm.
they're standing outside of a building that only a very select few can even tell them how it was created, let alone when or by who, right?
Yeah. And where I was in southern India, there was actually a dearth of good architecture. It was very, very poor. Like, we had to go way out of our way to try and find, I guess you would say, culturally uplifting monuments. I wasn't, other than a couple of the temples I went to, I wasn't awestruck like I was in Europe or in other places of the world.
Here, I just wanted to show this image.
Wow.
I toured this building when I was, a teenager.
That is still standing?
Still standing, and didn't give a shit about it. But when I got there, I was like, what? They built this with horse and buggies? Like,
No
that
way.
didn't make sense to me. And we
No.
took a tour, and the guy was telling us how many, I can't remember the number of bricks, but it has like 4 different types of stone in it. Hewn stone, bricks, blah, 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 marble.
Mm.
But this thing goes 4 stories underground. And the walls are anywhere from 10 to 16 feet thick. And like I said,
that makes sense.
They wanted to tear this down in the early 1900s, late 1800s. I can't remember the date. And they literally said that this would bankrupt the entire country of the United States to dismantle this building.
And do what with it? Like, put that material where?
Well, and so here's the funny thing. We've talked about the Great Walls of America, and in my upcoming show for Mississippi next week, I'll be talking about the Great Wall of Mississippi, which me and you have talked about Longo before. But they were using it as a quarry. And maybe, Topher, you can speak to this a little bit. But I'm sure a lot of these older buildings, they were just dismantling and using the stone. So the narrative in Mississippi is they needed to build a new courthouse in, I want to say Montgomery, but I may have it wrong. And so they just quarried this wall. And this wall went down so deep they never found the end of it. It was 20 feet wide, and they said that it was as well constructed as the Great Wall of China. And they even went as far as to say that it was a continuation of the Great Wall of China. And they never found the end of it or the beginning. They said it was at least 400 square miles.
Mm.
And, we've got these walls in Mexico. We found big walls in Florida. They have giant walls in Arizona, New Mexico, on and on. But yeah, I just wanted to show this building. I mean, let me just go show everybody.
It's a crazy one.
It looks even crazier now because it's sitting in the middle of downtown. Look at that.
How magnificent.
Oh, that's horrible. There, look, isn't that nuts though?
Nothing can even hold a candle to that.
But another funny thing is you hear that's kind of been a catchphrase lately is top heavy. But doesn't this thing look top heavy? To me, it looks like it probably goes another 20 stories below ground.
Oh, dude.
Is the top portion painted white, or is that like a metallic cap, like a copper?
It was actually all copper. So
I bet you at one time it was.
That's tarnished copper, like green copper. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. All these were copper.
Wow.
All the minarets or whatever you want to call them.
All
these
hail
were copper.
Venus.
And you can still see some of the old copper. It's still green at least. But yeah, I mean,
outstanding.
Doesn't that just look like there's at least 10 more stories, if not more, of this thing below ground? And all they publicly stated is that there was 6 stories or 4 stories below ground. I wouldn't doubt if there was a lot more. This is like the story of the Capitol building in Washington D.C. They found a basement they didn't even know was there,
Mm-hmm.
and the construction people, they had to like swear them to secrecy. There was no non-disclosure agreement contracts back then, so they were just like, we're going to put you in the gallows if you talk about this. And that's the capital of America, and they found a basement that they didn't even know was there.
Do you
Imagine the
mind?
first time they walked back into this building.
So what's the amalgamation of what you guys have been studying? Like, if you were to put a thesis out there and say, okay, here's the bird's eye view of what people have called Antiquitech, Tartaria, the Phoenician, whatever. Let's just call it the previous advanced civilization. Like, because I'm sort of like a big picture thinker, and I kind of want that bird's eye view. Like, where are you guys at with that right now? Like, have you kind of come to like a holistic picture of what all this means?
I'll let you go first, Longo.
Yeah, sure. I'm itching to go. But basically, I think I can best illustrate that by what I want. I'll just say what I want. If I could snap my fingers and make the world, my way, this is what it would look like. And I'll give you a brief reason why. Cities of stone is number one, what the world needs. Okay. And I was going to bring this up earlier because why did geopolymers have to go away? Why do they have to stay, woo-woo with the, out of left field communities, not given the time of day in mainstream? Well, because it completely eviscerates the real estate market. There's no such thing as a real estate market when the structures stay the same forever, and there's no leeches, parasites, money changers, worthless henchmen going in. Oh, we need to update this. Oh, tear out that kitchen because I want to flip that profit, twice the next year. So boom, right there. Cities of stone will quell all the extra, hanger-ons that are doing nothing and tearing down our cities and constructing cheap garbage with the intention of tearing it down 20 years from now to adjust for the increased profit value. So we can fix our property value at infinite if we build our cities with stone. That's one thing. We need fruit in the home, in the house. Why? You eviscerate poverty when you give mankind the ability to grow his own fruit and food. And people say, oh, well, berries, this or that. Right. Well, berries can't sustain you, can't sustain a family. Tropical produce can. Tropical produce, avocados, you talk about tropical produce, that can sustain thousands of people. Neighborhoods can sustain themselves. I've seen it. It can happen in Florida. So for me, I always go to the simple things. What does mankind need? And how did we get away from paradise and Eden? Because middlemen, either demonic in origin, interdimensional, I don't care. I know what bad is and I know good from bad. The bad originates from separating man from his needs, because our needs are there. There's no such thing. What we need is abundant and it's plentiful all around. And God has made it simple to live. This plane has been infested with demons, and these demons have planted themselves between you and your needs and have convinced you the path between there is vicious. You'll have to compete, you'll have to pay, you'll have to fight tooth and nail, and you'll have to spend your whole life securing those needs, when really you live in a beautiful place. Everything's there for you. And mankind would have no strife if these things were done. Cities of stone, an emphasis on fruit and tropical produce where permitting. And then the last thing would be an overall emphasis on beauty. Life has to be worth living. And when every, you walk through a natural area and every smell is pleasant, every gasp of air is pleasant, not overcharging, overstimulating, ruining your brain chemistry, but pleasant, perfect. And when cities are constructed out of stone, look at the building you just shared with us, Ben. If every building looked like that, every pass of your eye is like a massage to your consciousness.
Definitely.
Every sweep of your view is like a stroke with a calming brush. And when you conduct yourself and try to live in a brutal society with brutalist buildings, every sweep of your vision is like a blow to your face. It's like getting hit, getting pinned down, getting constricted. So brutalist architecture is brutal by nature, spiritually, you name it. So I think I don't know, does that sum it up? I think that's what,
Well,
the
kind of
return to Eden. The return to Eden is simple, and it's those. But yeah.
Well, how do you think we got here? Do you believe that there was a specific event? Or maybe that's more of what Topher was saying, or
sure.
several events?
Now listen, you don't want to ask me because I'll give you my truth, undoubtedly. I think man's original sin, okay? Who knows? Maybe we were just doing a-okay in the Garden of Eden. God said, all right, well, let's change the conditions. Let's change the parameters. Let's introduce another element, sin, so to speak, a deviation from what is harmonious. Well, why would that be profitable? Anyone who's listened to a piece of music, you're probably not listening to purely harmonious notes 100% of the time. The best songs, the best movies are the ones that are sweet, sour, up, down, hot, cold, everything. Okay. I know this is cliche, but yes, there's no good without the bad. And so you could say that there was no point in time where we went wrong, that the path is more of a state and it's not a linear story. But okay, make it simple. How did we go wrong? I would say it was the choice to consume animal flesh. That, if not already, we had deviated from our paradisical nature, that this cemented our new state of struggle, strife, and dependency on outside energy. Meaning we our means of transportation are reliant on outside, harvested, stolen, liquid energy. The human being largely conducts himself the same, seizing the nutrients of another being. And I see as above, so below, as within, so without. When we are corrupted in such a way, our industry will start to mirror that relationship. So that's my opinion. I'm not speaking for either of these two guys, but that's my how to get back to Eden. In the Garden of Eden, man ate fruits and vegetables. And a lot of the overcomplications, I think, just what did Plato say? All war goes to cattle grazing, goes to the choice of man to use meat as a food source. Is the origin of all warfare in the ancient world, was disputes over cattle ground. This is why England didn't have kings, didn't have organized rulership for 1,000 years or so, because they're all fighting over each other's cows. But blah 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 blah.
Well, Topher,
Awesome.
what do you think? You're kind of a special guest here. Me and Longo have bounced these ideas around, so I kind of want to make sure because I wish I knew you guys already had a talk, and I would have listened and been a little more polished on what you guys have covered already. So I'm kind of batting around in the dark here. But yeah, what do you think, Topher?
I believe we come from advanced very
from a construction standpoint, since
no,
that's kind
not
of
just
your
no, because you can't just have it from a construction
okay,
standpoint.
perfect, full spectrum.
It's consciousness.
Okay,
So I part of this is cosmology for me. So my cosmology is that we live on the plane of inertia. What I know about physics and harmonics, it just makes sense that we're on the plane of inertia. So we're in the dense zone of the plane of inertia, and depending on the consciousness, everybody, like two people could be witnessing the same thing, and one person's in heaven, the other person's in hell.
Can I share as you're saying this, Chris?
Yes.
Topher? Sorry. Can you share me, Ben, please?
oh yeah, sorry, of course.
So people see what he's talking about. Plane of inertia. Anyone who's interested in the shape of the planet, plane of inertia is a anagram for planet Earth, the planet Earth, just about. So
Pretty much. And so the plane of inertia is essentially where our spirit body condenses to have, like what Longo was just bringing up, trials and tribulations, and learn, get better. Like this is my projection onto it. I know I need to get better. So I project that out onto the world. Like I didn't come here as a perfect being. I know that there's things that my consciousness has had to work through, things that I've had to overcome. And so that's my projection on to the majority. Like I don't seek perfection in anybody. I just seek honesty. So given that, I personally was lucky because I had photos of my family from the turn of the 20th century, and they were all gorgeous. They were all like chiseled, beautiful, dressed perfectly, like very how should I say it? Simple dress, but everybody didn't have anything out of place. And then when I was a little kid, I would stare at this photo because I was like, they're so dignified. And the people of today are not as dignified.
mhm.
Even as a little child, I could understand the difference between somebody that felt really good about themselves relative to somebody that acted like they felt good about themselves. And so I feel very lucky that I saw that. So I think we have a dignified origin. And I think where we are in the cycle, I kind of been conditioned by the Upanishads and the Yuga cycles.
Mhm.
Like I think we're at the end. Well, I don't know where we are from a cyclical perspective, but I believe we are in the Iron Age. That's why we have all these buildings that are based on metal. And also the consciousness of that is this lower debased consciousness. And it's not to say that you can't have outliers within the plane of inertia, because within any petri dish or any test sample, you're always going to have, at the end of the bell curve, you're always going to have those that are kind of just outside it. They're not living within the mean, right? So I think what has occurred is there are these cycles that occurred. Our forebears had incredible, like I'm talking about way back, had incredible insight. They were just coming from a higher consciousness perspective. And we're in the entropic swing of the cycle. Like we're at the end of the entropy. And that's why there's just sort of like a disorder in general wherever you go. Like even like people that don't know the rainforest, like when I first moved to the rainforest, it was like, oh my God, this is pure and virgin. And within 3 years of living there, I understood almost all the green that people see are invasive vines that weren't indigenous to the area. So my virgin mind had this projection like, oh my God, this is so great. This is so wonderful. But it's just like anything that you look into now within the world, it's like, oh, there is a corruption. And I'm not heartbroken by the corruption. It's just like anything. It's like for the old souls, you don't on a soul level, you don't get to enjoy the good times without having the contrast of the bad times. And it's just like what Longo brought up earlier. So we're all, I believe in reincarnation. I'm pretty certain of that. I myself had a death experience and came back. So like I'm pretty sure that like we can't look at it from our limited, like it's only this lifetime perspective. We have to let our heart open and let our heart like go to the horizon and understand that we are a living continuum, and this particular life cycle that we're in is just at the lower end of what I would call the Iron Age. That's sort of the way I see it. And just like anything, like we'll get precursors, we'll get little hints, we'll get little tastes of the Copper Age or the Bronze Age, and then we'll get little hints of the Silver Age, and we'll get little hints of the Golden Age while we're in each previous age. But it's just, I think that's just what's going on. It's actually quite logical to me.
Mm-hmm.
How about you?
Kind of like we started earlier, that as things get more advanced.
Hey Ben, sorry. Can I was that $10 tip to you or to me?
I'm pretty sure it was to you because it's about meat eating, so I would imagine.
Okay. Well, Conan, I see your tip. I'd love to discuss that with you, and call in when I do my live chats. I'd be happy to take more time on it, but
it's a long-winded answer.
Yeah,
so
not right now, and I'm not dodging the question. Would love to get into it, but I would also love to hear Ben's answer to not answer, but summary of what we've been saying. So
yeah, I get this question a lot, and I have never really answered it. But Longo, I've talked with you off air about my kind of concepts of consciousness and how it relates to Eden. And if you look at the story of the Garden of Eden from a consciousness perspective, right, and just look at all the metaphors there, one of my favorite authors, Julian Jaynes, the late Julian Jaynes. If you guys haven't heard of him, The Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind is probably my top 3 book of all time, if not number 1. I too, Topher, had a near-death experience and an out-of-body experience. It was wrapped up in one, that motorcycle accident I mentioned earlier. And I've never taken psychedelics. I've never needed to. That incident,
switched you on.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it, I spent the next 15 years trying to understand with my mental mind what happened in that spiritual environment. And the only thing that I can really say is that you have to seek, you have to try to answer that question, but you can never feel like you have it figured out, as weird as that sounds. And why I brought up Julian Jaynes is his explanation is just really beautiful, and it's simple, kind of like the construction stuff we've been talking about, that when we go back, it's more advanced and it's often way more simple. And things in life today have gotten way too complex. And when you get away from Mother Earth and Mother Nature, that's where the complexity like leads you astray. And when you get back to nature, everything becomes very simple. So anyways, Julian Jaynes, his analogy of the Garden of Eden was that was man's hemisphere, second hemisphere developed. And they lost the age of innocence, meaning that man was guided by astral or inner voices, kind of like schizophrenia, but not to the extent that we know of it today.
This is also like Pandora's box, where
yes,
free will does not just entail freedom and self-fulfillment, and it also entails mental illness.
Correct.
A shit ton of it. Like independent thought comes along with.
There's a lot of baggage.
Yeah.
So. And like you mentioned, choice. That God, you said parameters, and I love that because there are a lot of things about it, about the realm, that are, like you said, the world is a stage, and there is a cyclical um, construct to the realm. It's beautiful. You can see God's design in everything. Whatever you define as God, that's fine.
Mhm.
But if you can't see that in everything, then you're missing out. God's in a cat, God's in a human, God's in a piece of stone, God's in everything. Animism, right? Kind of, you study animism, you realize that the ancients believed this, and
Mhm.
that's why their buildings were connected with everything, them, nature, blah blah blah, the stars.
Mhm.
But anyways, back to that. So that there was a shift, a parameter change. God created a new set of rules, and with that, He created the dualistic mind and the bicameral, and that through his study of not only poetry and art and literature, he found that people were writing differently 2,000, 3,000 years ago than they do now. It was all third person, and they were speaking auditorily, like they were being directed, like they weren't consciously making decisions.
Well,
And we've talked about Atlantis, and who was the first king of Atlantis? It was a stone. We've talked about the Greeks, their first king was a stone. If you go back to Cyclopean religion or cultures, they're worshiping um, an object, and it's often a stone, a magnetic stone, a lodestone. And Topher, we mentioned, and before we finish this off, I want you to talk about that a little bit. But we mentioned the lodestone and magnetic stones and what role they play in construction, but they played a huge role in religion. And when you look back at some of um, the Greek stories and some of the early philosophy from the Greeks, they describe the transition from the quote Garden of Eden, or the age of innocence, and the transition to idols and stone worship, is that they no longer had God directing them, and they were looking for His voice in anything.
Mhm.
And this is when people started burying people in big mounds, because you could still hear the voice of your grandfather.
Mhm.
Whereas before, they often burned the bodies. Cremation was the predominant form. And the mounds, as we've already talked about Longo, there were some that were burial mounds, but for the most part, they were constructions for temples, like Topher's talked about a little bit. I think we talked about that off air, but the geomagnetic relationships there. So, anyways, long story short, it's cyclical. We keep talking about all the different levels of resets or new civilizations that come in on top of the old and build a new city, or whatever. And Topher, you talked about cosmology and what role that plays, and me and Longo have beat this drum pretty endlessly. There is obviously a relationship between the stars and the plane that we live on,
Mhm.
and nothing's more cyclical and a marker of time than the sky, right?
Yes.
And we've already talked about Saturn, and I've shared my opinions about the mythology of Saturn, and that we leave the lead crown and we enter the lead body. We're slowed down. Our vibrations are slowed as we enter a physical body.
Mhm.
And as you said, we come here to learn. And the alchemical story of that learning, growing process is our transition from the feet back to the crown.
Mhm.
And that it's kind of like I don't want to say video game. In some ways, there are simulation-esque markers to it. And I think astrology bears a lot of that, the repeatability. But yeah, nature, when I lived on the farm, Topher, and I'm sure you can attest to this, I never felt more like I was just a piece of dirt in
Mhm.
a good way. And I think that's kind of the the underlying definition of it all, is that, like, no matter what, um, it's a choice. And the law of abundance, as Longo mentioned, we live in a world of endless abundance. And the trick of the middleman, whomever that is in your life,
Mhm.
is to make you think you live a life of scarcity, but it's not that way at all.
Mhm.
And mind frame, your state of mind, you are what you think. When you study the old alchemists, Topher, you mentioned this a little bit off air, alchemy, this connects with the Phoenicians and why their highest degree in their order was Q. Well, the alchemists, the highest level of their transmutation was Q. It was the quintessence, the fifth element. It was the ether. And to them, you impregnated the ether with your thoughts and your words and your actions and created the world that you wanted. And like you mentioned with the construction and all these um, previous civilizations that really had a lot of beauty, you had all these people who understood this. There was no confusion. And that everyone knew if you thought negative and evil things, you would create a dark, evil world around you. And if you surrounded yourself with people that did the same thing, it would just spread like a cancer, like a cell.
Mhm.
And if you did the opposite and you were attracted to people who thought positively and knew the power of thought and word and music and construction, because all these things, harmony is everything. Harmony goes
Yes.
through all things: music, construction, art. And that when humankind lost the kind of hive mind and was now set out into the world lost, kind of without the direction of God, and they had to figure it all out on their own. With that, you're going to get a lot of people wandering, addicted to drugs,
Mhm.
alcoholism, you know just that whole desperation that you've never seen more of it now than in your entire lifetime. Especially me, as someone from Portland, I cry when I drive through the city I was born in, because it's just turned into this pit of hell and
Mhm.
desperation and sadness. And I think it's kind of a mirror of everything that you see negative in life. It exists inside you, but you have to make that conscious choice and impart your will on the ether and, create the world you want for yourself and draw
Mhm.
people to yourself that you want to, like
Mhm.
when I met Longo, it was kind of a similar thing. And when you meet people like that in your life, when you're on this path of trying to answer these hard questions and better yourself and improve, that yeah. And that was a long-winded answer. I apologize, but ultimately, I the more I study, the less I know, and I'm
Mhm.
just always trying to be humble and keep looking, and but be humble and compassionate.
Mhm.
Like the story of the Bible for me is just like a self-help book, as crazy as that sounds. Like people overanalyze it. And Jesus was just saying, you live in a world of abundance and the world is what you make of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I read Julian Jaynes' book a long time ago, like 10 years ago,
Oh, great.
and it
Most people
struck
don't
me
know his.
it struck me because I kept having ringing in my mind was like the first rule of marketing: you tell people what they want. So, you have people that have no internal monologue, and then now they're set, and the hemispheres occur, and then the middleman, as Longo says, is like, hey, how about you do this? Because I to this day, I'm amazed of the amount of people I meet that do not have an internal monologue.
Yeah, it's
Oh
crazy.
yeah.
They don't have an internal monologue, and they don't have internal vision.
Yeah, back in the
Oh
day, the
yeah.
word zombie comes from someone who has no inner voice.
Yeah. These are your people lining up at your beep centers, getting beeped in their arm, right?
Yeah.
That were 2 years ago. Just heard it on the TV, heard it on the radio, showed up to get injected, and yeah.
And what's nuts about every single one of these people that I know, because I employ a bunch of them, is that as I'm getting to know them, the one thing that they strive for the most in their life, if you were to take an attribute that they want to have over all other attributes, it's the attribute of consistency. They just want to know what's going to happen.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Wow. I've seen that look.
It's like safety.
It's safety. And the thing is the more intelligent people I know, the people that have the internal monologue,
the farther you can cast a positive future.
Exactly.
It's
Not
the
only you
ultimate
can
form of safety. Yeah.
but it's not even just that. It's like it's going past that to being like there is no such thing as safety. Safety is illusory.
Mm-hmm.
Safety is counter to growth.
Exactly. But the people I've noticed in that I mean literally once I figured this out, my life got much easier because that's not my projection onto the world. I'm never thinking about consistency or safety.
Yeah.
But and so I'd
Mm-hmm.
have lots of strife with people because I'm more of an artist. I'm more of like, fuck it, let's experiment, let's do this, let's try this, let's go here. But the people that I employ, like their number one thing is like, okay, tell me exactly what's happening and when it's happening, and like I need to know. And then in getting to know them over like 11 years, it's just like literally, and then I can't say any of my peers because I don't find that type of person intellectually stimulating enough for me
Yeah.
where I can have a heart connection with them. Like I can love them as a consistent person. I can love them for what they are, but they're not anybody I would go out of my way to like spend time with.
Can I just lasso this all, like literally every single
Yes,
component
do it.
here together? And I'm not saying we're gonna conclude it here. I'm just saying, do you know what? Okay, Saint Augustine. Do you know what Saint Augustine is perhaps most famous for? His innovation.
Really?
Do you know what? Well, I was saying what his innovation. This is extreme. Like when my brother told me this, I almost couldn't believe him. And I got to get you and my brother together, Ben. That'd be a great one. But
me too.
Okay, yeah. That's Saint Augustine. Do you know what Saint Augustine? You know what he did one time that shocked the world? He was allegedly, remember, reading was not exactly something everyone could do. Reading, St. Augustine could read inside his mind. Now, we all read inside. Well, here, Topher, some of those people you were describing, how you can tell them, is they read with their lips. That they can't read a book and just ingest it. They have to mirror it. They have to physically act it out to blah, blah, blah. They can't internalize, imagine, text, articulation inside the head. So you see these people when they read. And I'm not saying just because a lot of people read with their lips. So this isn't like a negative.
It's not a blanket statement.
Exactly. But this is an indicator that someone's not processing, words internally the same way. But
Yeah.
St. Augustine, allegedly, was one of the first people ever recorded to be able to read without speaking out loud. Up until that point, it was almost the norm for people to read and talk at the same time as they're reading.
Mm-hmm.
It was not common to read a book and to completely internally digest it. So St. Augustine, who is famous for that, also happens to be the person they named that monolithic city in America's oldest city, St. Augustine. So you have the geopolymer and the bicameral mind being revealed to humanity, kind of both lassoed in right there by St. Augustine. My brother can do a much better version of that story. I'm a little rusty on the details of that with St. Augustine, but my brother knows it better.
Growing up, that was like my favorite town to go to. Other than Coral Gables, it's so funny because you really highlight St. Augustine and Coral Gables,
Yep.
and those were literally, as a Broward County kid, like whenever we went up to St. Augustine, I was so enamored with that place, how it felt. Like I just loved it. And then going down to Coral Gables and being amongst all those banyan trees, and then I remember my dad pointing out the Art Deco, and he was like, he would look at the Art Deco structures. And now when I think about the Art Deco structures, I bet you they're just hiding all the Moorish architecture underneath it.
Well, do you know what my take on Art Deco is? We're about 100 years away from the golden age of Art Deco, just about, or Art Nouveau transitioning into Art Deco.
Mhm.
The 20s, right? Gilded Age. Art Deco is somewhat of the Tartarian architecture because it draws from Greek influence. It draws from a little bit of Moorish, a little bit of Gothic, a little bit of this. And of course, a lot of it was bridging the gap into brutalism, which I think a lot of people, which gives Art Deco a bad rap in a lot of people's minds.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah.
It doesn't mind. I as an art, as like a style, I definitely wasn't my favorite, especially in the tropics. It seems like Art Deco would totally work really well in a more desert environment, much more so than an environment that gets lots of rain.
You don't like Miami's like typical Art Deco?
No.
That's what's considered to give Miami its distinct, vibe, vaporwave vibe.
From people that I don't think have that much taste. I think there's so many other things in Miami that make Miami beautiful. Like when you're down in Coral Gables, when I was in Coral Gables, I wasn't looking at the Art Deco architecture. It was mainly the Mediterranean, and then what's the neo-tropical architecture. Those two were like the ones that were just stunning. Like you talk about aesthetics, like you look at it and like your eyes are being massaged because the sight lines are beautiful.
Hey,
And it's also functional.
So Topher, you grew up in Broward County, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Now that's just south of me. I'm in Palm Beach County. And him and I have talked a lot about some of the sites I've gone to, the mounds,
the golf courses, man,
the Tequesta sites, banyan trees, etc. This is the essence of growing up in Florida, some of that. But what do the Cowboy Rickshaw video was filmed in Hollywood
There's
Hollywood,
your staff.
Florida. Well, my pen here, let me use selenite. This is a better one. Cool. But this is good for both you guys too. This is selenite, the moonstone for both you. Cancer, Taurus, Selena, Luna, moonstone. But what was I saying?
You're talking about South Florida, the essence.
Hollywood.
Okay, so Hollywood, Florida, architectural styles. Hollywood, Florida, the Hollywood Lakes area. That's by those two dredged out
keyholes.
Yeah, it's bizarre. That was overseen by the same guy that did the Panama Canal. So that large of an operation in Hollywood. Why am I talking about it? Because in the Hollywood Lakes, and that's what those are, the Hollywood Lakes, those two, right? Those Hollywood Lakes, that neighborhood allegedly has like almost every architectural style known to man, or at least from Eurasia. I don't even know, but that's what the guy was bragging, or saying, well, we have almost any style of architecture you can name is represented in the Hollywood Lakes area, this old 100-year-old neighborhood.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Almost all the ones you're just listing off.
I love architecture, and I've been fortunate enough to have traveled all over the world. And as I look back on all of them, like all that really sticks out to me is like the water and the nature. Like, of course, buildings stick with me, But like, I have family in Florida, and I've been to Florida countless times. And as you guys are talking about Florida, I've been to Miami, I've been all over Florida, and I don't remember barely any buildings. I just remember what the sand felt like. I remember how different it felt in Miami than it did in Tampa, than it did in Pensacola.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that the water was saltier at each place, or less salty, and that it was warmer. You know what I mean? I don't know if you guys feel that way, but it's just funny. Like, architecture is important and amazing, but it's weird how my mind, I don't know if it's the same for you, holds on to smells and feeling and touching of like trees and nature. And like,
Yes.
in Asia, I'll never remember I toured all the temples in Thailand and Cambodia, but I'll remember the humidity in the jungle
Oh,
and
I bet.
the feeling of the mud more than I'll remember what the temples look like.
Can I touch on this, because it's such a good concept that when you're that young, the mind is not complicated. And those flat surfaces, when we walk around today with this complicated mind, those flat surfaces are like radio dishes or satellite dishes, bouncing back our complications and our stresses, and the flat structures, the type of brutalist. And I know you were talking about good architecture too, how it just doesn't register in the memory because it's secondary to that primal awareness that is, food, moisture, heat, warmth, presence. And architecture is secondary, and it denotes a separation from,
Great, yeah, with the straight lines and masculine, and it has to be built up above the ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's why the cave was, to the mystery schools, so feminine, and that was where the real temples were in caves.
Well, nothing's erected.
Exactly.
You go down, it's not erected.
Yeah.
You're erected.
It's crafted by,
it's routed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a part of an old tree that's rotted out.
Hey, don't get me going down that road. But yeah,
this is awesome.
It is an interesting correlation with the architecture thing. I agree, because you spend enough time in cities, and I would much rather 99 out of 100 times go to a beach than go to a city. There's plenty of beautiful things in Florida I look forward to seeing, things that I saw and don't remember.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's like the ocean and water have always spoke to me. Maybe that's the cancer side of me, but I've always been drawn to the ocean.
Now, if I can, I agree with you, but let me tell you, when I was like 19, I started getting into the fruit in Florida. It occurred to me that I'd lived all this life in Florida and had never paid attention to the fruit.
Yeah.
Like I knew there was mangoes. I know there's coconuts. I know there's banana. I know it's all here, but it literally didn't present itself to my vision. I'd walk through the same streets when I was 17 and just see power lines. But the mango trees were there. I just didn't see them. Mm-hmm. I didn't care that the color on the fruit didn't act on my consciousness. Now my head's on a swivel. It's like mango, banana, there's an avocado, and I'm like archiving them all as I'm like driving around. It's all I'm thinking about is, wow, I didn't see that one before. Didn't see that one.
You'll get a kick out of this. Like, my parents live in the oldest neighborhood in Fort Lauderdale. And when I was a kid, we would just skateboard and ride our bikes in there because it was like old timers lived in there.
Mm-hmm.
And now when I go visit my mother, I'll go food forage. I'll grab avocados, mangoes, papayas, Suriname cherries, and I'll come back with what would cost a few $100 at Whole Foods, just from her neighbors, and nobody even knows that stuff is even in their yard.
Yeah, it's like the anchors.
Oh, that's the best part about Florida is, why am I saying all this? How do I know a renaissance can occur? Because all the people that have these fruit trees, most of them don't have, number one, they don't even know it's edible.
Right.
Even if it was edible, they wouldn't want to eat it because they'd rather have microwaved garbage. And if you could just get a person in that house that would take full advantage of that tree, and and would plant more, etc., and would use it, you're going to shape the country, steer the country in a whole another direction. You can't deceive someone that grows their own food.
No.
Yeah,
That collects their own water.
This is the big problem with the quote Aboriginals, right?
Yeah.
They were like, we don't need your government. We don't need anything you're offering. I got to go check on something. I'll be right back. Give me a second.
No worries, man.
The food forest that's in the dead center of Fort Lauderdale, like where all the skyline buildings are off US 1. There's a couple of neighborhoods that are just east of US 1. They're on these old canal systems. They still have the big fig trees. They still have mangroves in some of the canals. The mangoes are out of this world. There's
I
like
know.
10 different varieties of mangoes. You can literally, every other house has a flourishing coconut tree. And I like my daughter, the first 6 months of her life, she lived off coconut water and breast milk. Like it's a perfect
sounds like a hell of a night.
So like her, like there's just so much abundance, and people just because their consciousness isn't attuned to it, they don't see it.
Yes, dude, it's I had the pleasure of growing up on a golf neighborhood, like in Florida. You know exactly what I mean. Half the neighborhoods down here are golf neighborhoods. They have a golf course, a golf membership, and a clubhouse and all this stuff. It's not only the rich neighborhoods that all have golf courses in Florida. It's not just the gated communities. There are open, public style neighborhoods that have full blown golf courses, multiple golf courses.
That was what I grew up on.
So I've lived on golf course a couple different places, and where I grew up was pretty much directly on a golf course. I would, like I said, when I was 19 and got into like the vegan food industry and just fruit in general, I would go walk on the golf course with a backpack, right? I would load that thing up with, like you just said, 10 types of mangoes. No. 25 different types of mangoes in one neighborhood alone. You can find green, long and green, wide and green, long and purple, wide and purple, wide and, orange mango, yellow mango, Haitian mango, Tommy Jones, whatever that they are, the conventional mangoes. But all of this, none of this was planted. None of this was like some of it was, but birds, raccoons, whatever, drop it and it just comes up like wildfire.
Yeah.
And it's there, and they have to fight it back. They have to fight these trees back to let the golf course have its way. So in my neighborhood that I grew up in, it wasn't just the mangoes, the papayas lining like the back, almost every backyard, a papaya tree. Why? Because a papaya tree, if you plant one papaya tree and you don't root them out when they grow up, weed them out as they're sprouting up, you'll have 300 papaya trees, right? Like in a couple of years. It's crazy because the seeds disperse. They're so blah, blah, blah. So you get it.
Yes.
Limes. Everyone should be able to live like this. I'd be in my kitchen. I'm cooking, guacamole or something. I'm making something that calls for lime. I'm like, fuck, I don't have any lime. Oh, well, there's 6 lime trees right on the other side of the golf course. Just stop what I'm doing, right? Turn the heat off, whatever. Go out the backyard and literally get a fresh lime that is the best lime you've ever had. And it's right there. So everyone in Florida can live like that. Most of the people along the Gulf Coast can live like that. Yeah.
It's brilliant. I used to get kind of mad living in Costa Rica because people think in Costa Rica it's easy to grow food.
Mm,
And I'm a South Florida boy. And like you said, like literally like if you wanted bananas, papaya, lime, any type of citrus, it's like it's so easy. It's effortlessly easy. But down in the rainforest,
mm,
or what should be rainforest, first of all, you're not dealing with a sandy, loamy soil like you have in Costa or in Florida. In Costa Rica, it's bauxite clay.
mm,
And that whole area, you talk about an area that was supposed to be, all canopy all the time, nothing else. It's Central America. It's not meant to have all these undercarriage fruits
mhm,
at all. And so like I remember I was just like, God, my house growing up on this golf course in Florida, like literally we would feed our German shepherds of the excess avocados
yeah.
falling off of our trees. Like we had so much food in such a quarter acre lot, you know, that it was like it was effortless. The amount of effort that I had to put in to grow anything in Costa Rica that was worth anything, where the bugs wouldn't come and eat it immediately, was
Mhm.
tremendous.
Wow. I would
Yeah.
not expect that. See, I just learned. I would have expected that you have at least similar, yield in terms of like energy input, manual energy.
No,
That
Florida is so much easier. So
wow.
much easier because the bugs in Florida are a lot less aggressive.
Well, that's another testament to this whole Edenic concept that tropical is not necessarily what we're striving for.
No,
Because
neotropic.
right, you want subtropic on the border of tropical,
Right.
which Florida is one of those rare places on the planet that has a lot of that. And that's why citrus, by the way, citrus is not a tropical fruit. A lot of times, most of the world, most of the culinary world will get this wrong. They'll put orange, tangerine, grapefruit in with tropical fruit. Citrus is not a tropical fruit. Officially, we're told citrus comes from China and India and places that are not. Now, parts of China and India are tropical, but where citrus is supposed to come from is not tropical.
Mhm.
It's so Florida, however, does have the qualities, does have what's necessary for both tropical produce and semi-tropical or subtropical or things that would grow in the highlands elsewhere can grow low in Florida. It's unusual. For example, grapes. Grapes have to be cultivated with extreme care, extreme attention, tradition. You're keeping this alive, and it's, sometimes they'll have like a sourdough starter. They'll have the same grapevine in a family for
Right.
hundreds of years, and in Florida, this is one of the things that would just strike the conquistadors dead. It was like, well, not dead, but it would just knock their socks off. They'd say, why are the grapes growing in the wild here rounder, sweeter, ripen better to perfection than the grapes that we labor? My uncle died in the not me, but this is a conquistador speaking. But every grape grower in my family has labored tremendously, and here in this land, you're telling me they just grow by the millions,
Mhm.
abundantly, perfectly ripe.
Mhm.
It's like God's playing a joke or something.
Well, that was
That's
like the
great.
avocado. They called it the fruit of Atlantis, and they said it wouldn't grow
Really?
anywhere if it wasn't cultivated, but they found it growing wild in Florida.
Mm. Wow.
Oh, we had it growing wild in my backyard. We didn't plant it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's taken over in Hawaii too, but same thing.
Gentlemen,
Those-
I gotta. My daughter is going nuts here.
Oh
I'm
yeah, that's
gonna.
why I had a breakaway too, because my youngest is
That's all right. We
screaming
can
for me as well.
we can wrap it up here, y'all.
Topher,
Awesome.
I've loved every minute of it. If you ever want to have me on your show, I'd love to. I'm sure we could go all day with some and come at it more from your perspective. We could talk about farming and biodynamics and Steiner, and
Oh,
we
I
could go
love all
all
that.
day. So if you ever
Yeah.
want to, just get my contact information from Longo. I'd love to.
What I really want to dive into you with, and I have Stellium 7 on next week.
Oh, sweet.
I want to know what the F. Here's my daughter. I want to know what is, what's it called? Petrification.
Yeah.
Ooh, yeah.
Because I've played with plasmas, with water plasmas, and I've played with high voltage plasmas, and there's very weird, quirky shit that goes on. And so the model that you guys are painting with these massive trees, the petrification, because when I went out to the petrified forest in Arizona and they're like, oh, this is caused from pressure and sediment. I'm like, this is all topside. It's all above fucking ground. How can you say it's a petrified forest?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
I am like, I've been following both of your guys' work like to the T because I want to get to the bottom of what is petrification.
Yeah, I'm down. Yeah,
Well,
Stellium's a good friend of mine, a personal friend.
Awesome.
And actually, he called me on the phone just before I started this and was like, hey, what's up with Longo?
Nice.
What's going on with Longo? I was like, go on the show. Go on his show. You'll love it.
Yeah, well, I was just going to tell you I reached out to him. So, yeah.
Yeah, he's a great guy, smart dude. But, yeah, I would love to. So we both have little kids, and I definitely got to get going. I loved every minute of it. And Longo knows I could do one of these every single night, and we never run out of material. So it was a real pleasure, Topher, to meet you.
Very
get
nice
his contact information, and let's do this again.
Awesome. You guys have a great night.
Well, here, I'm going to – all right, well, Topher, feel free to sign off, man. Have a good night.
Hey, I don't know how this is posted, but could you guys just put Topher HQ on the whatever, on the placard?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're in there right now.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen. You have a good one.
Peace.
Night, brother.
Have a good night.
Well, as always, Longo, that was fantastic. I wasn't quite sure who your guest was going to be, but that was awesome.
Yeah, you guys did more talking, and
I know I tried to shut up. So
no, that's great.
That was awesome.
Anytime I can sit back and learn is.
I think we should do another one, us three again for sure. So you set that up, or we'll plan something and do another one of these. Hopefully, everyone in the chat almost broke 600 tonight between us two. Pretty awesome. I hope you guys love the talk.
That's the trouble when you and I both go live at the same time as so much of the same audience. It's not a trouble. It's not a trouble. It's a blessing. But
it is a blessing. But yeah, it's funny.
The numbers don't show that, because
the double audience.
Right.
Yeah, and I owe a lot of my fan base to the work I did with you, obviously, and kickstarting everything. So, many blessings to Longo, and thanks to all you listeners and everybody out there for tuning in. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And let us know. Should we do another one with Topher? I think we should, and I bet you guys feel the same way. So, give us some things to talk about in the comments for the video, and let us know what you think. And
So hang on. He didn't. I want to close this off. He didn't plug himself at the end here, but Topher HQ is what he goes by. But Biocharisma Podcast, the Biocharisma or Biocharisma Podcast. I think he has two channels by that name. So shout out Topher. Thanks to him for joining us. He didn't get into it. He's a close friend of Owen Benjamin. Owen Benjamin show. So
very cool.
It. Yeah. But thanks everyone for joining tonight. And
love you guys.
That's all right. That's it.
Okay.
Well, yeah.
Have a good night.
You gotta lock us out.
Copy.
Okay.